The Finance Minister has tabled the economic survey in the Parliament just a short while back. It's the second authored by Chief Economic Advisor Krishnamurthy Subramanian. And while it does moderate growth expectations in the current and the coming fiscal years, it has also recommended lowering subsidies and redirecting the money to sectors that can spur growth.
Joining us now with the thoughts on some of the recommendations and the implications of it are Siddharth Sanyal, Chief Economist at Bandhan Bank, and market veteran Ajay Bagga. Gentlemen, thanks very much for taking out the time. I'll start off with you, Siddharth. 5%, that was the advance estimate for FY19, for FY19 and for 20, FY21, 6 to 6.5%. That's something that the market, I guess, is already factoring in.
5% government talking about a 5% growth rate in for this particular financial year is not a surprise. 6 to 6.5% for the next financial year, it's possible, but possibly we have to continue doing a few things right.
You feel that this is also a stretch?
In a way, with some of the forecasters would, at this point of time, predict a slightly lower number. For example, if you see the IMF's forecast, which came out recently, they do expect the number to be slightly lower. This will be slightly on the higher side compared to some of the other forecasters at this juncture. I'll not say this is not possible, but at the same time, we possibly need to fix a few of the problems early enough during the year, rather than just waiting for the growth recovery to happen on its own.
The things that they say and the uptick in the second half of 2019-20 to start off with, a lot of factors, including a pickup in the Nifty notwithstanding, but 2 or 3 crucial things. There are some market-linked things and some economic-linked things. They're saying that there's a positive outlook for rural consumption and rebound of industrial activity. Now, I can understand the outlook for rural consumption to be almost a sitter, but the rebound in industrial activity, Siddharth, what would your thoughts be on this?
In case of second half of 2019-20,
yes,
it will not be very easy. We might have to build in some disappointment here potentially, and there are multiple factors at this juncture. If you see generally the sentiment from both from consumers as well as from business, it's not really looking that great. I don't really expect that to change dramatically over the course of the remaining couple of months of the year, and it might actually take slightly longer to take place, or the recovery might be slightly more backloaded than what we are expecting now. Having said that, the good things here is while there had been quite a few disruptions on multiple fronts over the course of the last few months, some of the things will be possibly behind us. For example, there had been significant or some clarity at least emerging in case of the auto sector, Rabi crop in case of the upcoming harvest season might potentially be significantly better. Typically with good monsoon during the Kharif season and all moisture content, etc. at the ground level helps Rabi crop quite a bit. As well as once the new financial year starts, the government would be having the headroom of the New Year's spending, so to say. So that way, some of the things can actually be a little more helpful 3 months down the line. But whether that can change the course of sentiment as well as the momentum of growth over the course of the remaining 2 months of the year, I'd be rather slightly more concerned to go for a very strong assumption on that particular front.
Okay. Soumyakanti Ghosh, Chief Economic Advisor to the State Bank of India, is also joining us right now on the show. Soumya, thanks very much for taking out the time. Just getting your initial thoughts on the number that has been put out for FY21, 6 to 6.5%. Do you too feel that this could slightly be a stretch, and maybe we might fall short of that unless and until some big measures are not taken to make sure that growth comes back on track?
Yeah, 6 to 6.5% is on the higher side, and this actually could translate into a nominal GDP growth rate of around 11%. So if I work with a 4.5% inflation number next year, so this could be a little bit of on the higher side. So because the market is expecting a nominal GDP growth of around 10 to 10.5%, but at 11% it could be it could be on the higher side. But the important point over here is that we have to strive and delicate balance, because if we start with also 10%, there is also the message that we are actually setting our bar a little lower. So possibly 11% may be on the higher side, but it's trying to balance the market expectations, trying to balance the overall sentiments in the economy with the market expectations.
Okay. Ajay Bagga is also with us. Amongst the other things, Mr. Bagga, they're saying, and that's pretty interesting stuff in the highlights of the economic survey. It goes on to say that the aspiration of becoming a 5 trillion economy as well depends critically on promoting pro-business policy and weaning away from pro-crony policy that may favor specific private interests, especially powerful incumbents. Strong words, Mr. Bagga.
Yeah, sorry, I missed the last part of your question, Niraj. There was
especially powerful incumbents, Mr. Bagga, is what the eco survey says, that should veer away from that. So we'll get to that too, but just an initial thought on the numbers provided, and if you have a thought on some of the comments that I just read out.
See, again, the economic survey, we read it in 3 ways, Niraj, every year. One is that it's prescriptive. It is not something mandatory. So it is got a lot of very good ideas. You know, be it the universal basic income that Arvind Subramaniam propagated, which the Congress had taken into its manifesto also for 2019 elections, be it the nudge theory, the behavioral economics, very nice chapter that was written in the last year. So we look forward to fresh ideas. If you didn't have a political constraint and electability constraint, what could you run the economy in a very utopian manner? Second big part is it signals some part of the government intention. So it is a signaling document, given that it comes before the budget. And the third big part is it gives a wealth of data for the past. So that's how you should look at the economic survey. It's prescriptive. It is a bit of utopia. It is a bit of signaling as well. And overall, they try to balance it. Looking at this document, I've not read it because it just come out a few minutes back. But seeing the highlights, Niraj, that you were showing earlier, it looks more optimistic. The base effect will kick in from this quarter itself. Our fundamental thesis is the economy probably bottomed out. That did not factor in the coronavirus. So with the new virus induced Chinese slowdown, and China is a supply chain partner even for us, right from chemicals to electronics to components. So a Chinese slowdown would have a global impact. We will not be spared from that. Remove that, we were basically premising that the economy is probably bottomed out, base effect kicks in, and second half of the next financial year, we were expecting an uptick. So 6.5 looks difficult, but we think we could be in the 5.5 to 6% range.
All right, 5.5 to 6% range. Just want to add to that point. The survey is also saying that the uptick in the second half of 1920 could come on the back of 10 positive factors. But where we are at now and what can be done to make sure that this continues or gets spruced up? Firstly, a higher FDI flows, build up of demand pressure, but looking at the coming off of inflation in the month of December, that probably projecting weakening of demand pressure in the economy. So you have to see a steady pickup of the demand pressure, positive outlook for rural markets, consumption pickup, rebound in industrial activity, steady improvement in manufacturing growth. The list is quite long of those 10 things that can spur the overall uptick in the second half. But Siddharth, this is something that we all want, but how to tackle each of these?
See, if you look at, for example, if I pick up that point on inflation, that inflation has gone higher, and that might actually show some bit of uptick in demand situation in the economy. I'd rather like to highlight that the current spike in inflation is actually very, very concentrated in case of a few food items, vegetables, for example, which is more due to the supply side shocks rather than anything else. If I look at a broader basket of industrial commodities, the pricing power in the economy is not really that strong. Yeah. So overall, some of these things, that's why I said that we might reach the 6% level next year, especially if we try to address some of these things, some of the problems we are facing at this moment proactively, rather than waiting for the markets and the economy to correct on its own over the course of the next few months. But whether we can anticipate a significant uptick in H2 of the current financial year, I'd be slightly more skeptical at this moment. So overall, the momentum can be slightly more disappointing at this juncture, because there had been new headwinds over the course of the last few months. And what I keep on noticing every now and then, that overall sentiment at this juncture is not particularly strong. So if you look at some of the surveys, sentiment surveys that RBI brings out every now and then, and the next round will be available next week, on some of the crucial aspects, such as overall economic condition, employment scenario, income growth, continuously the number is turning a little more worse over the course of the H2 of, say, calendar year 2019. So I'd be slightly, I'll be keeping my fingers crossed to, rather than taking a very optimistic number for H2 1920.
Right. Soumya, I just want to come to you on your take on rationalizing subsidies, as a tool for expanding fiscal headroom, and particularly food subsidies, which is, been spoken about as well.
No, I think this we have been listening for a long time, rationalizing subsidies, but in a country, and this is always a political issue, so I'm not sure how much of the rationalization of food subsidy could be done. Because the point is that at the end of the day today, if you look into the agricultural sector, the investment is always a laggard, because of the simple reason is that most of the because of the subsidy system. So there has been a lot of demand of rationalizing and trimming the subsidies and ramping up public investment, but unfortunately, given the fact that subsidies have been rising, and the implementation of the Prime Minister Kishan scheme was a correct step in that direction of augmenting the income generating capacity of the farmers. But if you are augmenting the income generating capacity of the farmers, you also need to rationalize some of the subsidies which is currently existing in the system, because both cannot coexist together. So and the other important thing is that but at this point of time also, I think the government is talking about routing some of the fertilizer subsidies, the DBT subsidies, through the DBT route next year, so that could save some amount of money. But to me, I think rationalizing subsidies is an important factor in the path of agricultural reforms, but I am not sure how much of that could be taken forward, given that there is a lack of political consensus on this topic.
So Soumya, then the finance minister, indeed the government is caught between the rock and a hard place, right? We all know that, frankly, if you want to look at all of the things, which is fiscal consolidation, demand stimulus, and credible accounting, it's a bit of an impossible trinity.
Yes, actually it's a very difficult job, because at the end of the day, you have subsidies, you have expenditures, and given the fact that this year the budget is basically going to be a very tough act, because we know that there will be a fiscal slippage, but next year what will be the fiscal target, the credibility of the fiscal target to the market. So I think these are all challenging tasks, and my sense is that it's really very difficult to say. It's very difficult to say that you rationalize the expenditures, pump up the revenue. But one important data point which I would like to highlight, if you actually look into the history of the last 50 years and look into the tax buoyancy of the personal income tax, corporate income tax, then excise and customs, you will find remarkably that the buoyancy in the corporate income tax has actually almost collapsed from 2011 till to 1920. So I think that's the major problem, because there has been significant deceleration in the corporate sector because of several issues like deleveraging, because of ranging up debt, and that has actually created the problem. So while we appreciate that that a lot of people are talking about the GST reforms and all these other things, but to me, at the end of the day, I think until and unless the private sector investment picks up, it will be very difficult for us to reach that aspiration level of 5 trillion. So in my sense, I think we need to see in the budget that what could be the tax numbers which the government is projecting. But I sense that the tax cut which the government did on corporate investment, that could happen to be a structural change insofar if it helps to pick up the pace in the corporate tax buoyancy, because that is where we have been lagging if you look into the history from 1970 till 2020.
Well, there's some hope that maybe some of that money could also come back as dividends, because I don't think corporates have gone out and invested that money thus far. Let's wait and watch. Hopefully that happens. Mr. Bagga, one thing that the survey highlights and something that almost everybody anticipates should come out in the budget as well is something around the NBFC sector. They're clearly stating that efficient allocation of liquidity enhancements across firms in the NBFC space, thereby arresting or trying to arrest the financial fragility. Important points, all of us know about it. Anything out of the box that you think can be and should be done tomorrow?
You know, Niraj, last 16, 17 months post ILFS, we have not had much movement from the government. Very cosmetic kind of measures have been taken, and if you look at even the lifeline that was thrown, no bank has really lent to NBFCs under that. So $335 billion of lending out, they don't have any refinance facility except for the top 4 or 5 who are able to refinance. Traditional lenders like mutual funds, insurance companies, having burnt their hands with the likes of DHFL and others, have really moved out of the market. What we needed was a TARP kind of a thing, and it's not really throwing good money after bad, because a lot of it is good money that is there on the NBFC balance sheets, but you've consigned them to a slow death, and that's showing up in the overall credit numbers, because 30% of the credit of the country was from the shadow banking, and that has got severely constrained, and the banks have not been able to pick up most of it, and there are segments which banks normally do not touch and which NBFCs were able to touch. So it's been a combination of both, and will some measure come through? I have my doubt. I'm very skeptical. The government is rather waiting that let the private sector sort it out themselves, and let the market forces shape out who survives and who gets killed. I'm not really looking at much for NBFCs. Hopefully on the real estate, on the affordable housing, and some kind of a package for rental housing. If that comes through, on a second order effect, it will help the NBFCs who are able to survive, but a lot of them will go down under, because the funding, the refinancing is constrained. So not much hope on that end, Niraj.
Siddharth, anything that you're expecting with regards to commentary around divestments? They've fallen miserably short of the target that they set out. Do you expect an even aggressive divestment target to come about? And what exactly is the comfort level in terms of how much divestment should the government aim at, so that there is no crowding out of other investments in other avenues? That's
a very delicate balance, very, very valid point. Now, one particular thing we have seen repeatedly, that in the last several years we have seen high targets and eventually not such a higher number in terms of the eventual delivery. But two things can still help the government to justify a slightly stronger number this time, because they are talking about some of the strategic divestments, taking down the government's holding in some of the companies significantly lower than the 50% level, etc. So if they go for some kind of a clear roadmap on that, that can justify a strong number. Also the discussions about Air India, etc., whether some of those chunky flows eventually hit the market. But I share that particular concern of yours, that if that particular number turns out to be very, very big, then that might actually pose some kind of a question mark for the other segment of the market also. Yeah. Valid concern.
Yeah. Okay, just start wrapping out this conversation. And Samya, come to you first. Anything from the budget speech in terms of numbers that you're going to be watching out for? whether it be with regards to the net tax revenues, where the 2020 budgeted estimates were 16.49 lakh crores, whether it's going to be with regards to the overall direct tax collections, indirect tax collections, anything, gross borrowing number, if that seems to get overinflated, will that be a big concern? What is that one or two numbers that you're going to be watching out for?
See, I'll be definitely looking into the total budgeted tax revenue. I expect the numbers to be not more than 10 to 11%. So any number higher than that could actually mean that the numbers could be a little bit on the higher side. But now, given that the fact that the GDP growth rate is projected at 6 to 6.5%, the nominal GDP growth could be at 11% in the budget. That means the tax growth could be closer to 11%. So that could be a little bit on the higher side. The second thing I would like to see what's the numbers on the non-tax revenue, because that is one aspect which is, I mean, given the fact that we are still trying to sort out the telecom sector, what happened in the telecom sector. So that sector number is also going to be important, because that has been one source of revenue where we are depending on in terms of our fiscal corrections. The third thing is obviously the disinvestment receipts, but I think that the disinvestment numbers this time ought to be higher, given the fact that there are several pending disinvestments which are going to happen. So, and the finally important thing is that even if we are assuming that the fiscal deficit this year is at 3.8 to 4%, the next year fiscal deficit should not be significantly lower than 3.8%, because any number which is say closer to 3.5%, we may actually end up the risk of breaching that number. So a higher number is always better, and then you overachieve the number and get to a, say, you target 3.7 and then see you have done 3.6, because that will be a surprise for the market. And of course, I've been hearing in the press is that given a true position of the fiscal in terms of the overall off-balance sheet borrowings. So overall, the numbers should be realistic, because the realistic numbers, even if they are on the lower side, could actually add a lot of confidence to the market in terms of the overall glide path of the economy as also the fiscal one.
There's some mention about this in the survey as well, but Siddharth, you want to dwell on this as well? I mean, what is it that you believe should be a realistic, and I think Soumyakanti Ghosh is laying out a perfect recipe, that it should be a believable number that the government gives out tomorrow.
Absolutely, that's the most important thing. We need a granular roadmap in terms of fiscal consolidation, rather than a very optimistic, rosy scenario to start with and then eventually missing it. In this particular financial year, they started with 3.3. There is a FRBM escape clause which can give them headroom up to 3.8. Now, what the government has continuously said over the course of the last few years, that eventually they want to move up to 3%, that has guided market expectation to necessarily believe that the next year's number has to be lower than this year's number. But if you want to be realistic, and if you want to be really, really counter-cyclical, you should not possibly constrain yourself to that particular number.
What about the rating agencies?
That's a concern, but rating agencies will not necessarily be kind to you if your growth numbers continues to falter as well. So eventually what we have seen in case of India, the tax buoyancy comes back when growth rate is strong. Yeah. So it's possibly one particular path. I'm not saying that's necessarily the path, but one particular path worth considering, that even if this year's number, we do expect this particular year's number to be in between 3.6 to 3.8, but necessarily it should not be constrained that it has to be lower than this year's number. If you think you really want to be aggressive and counter-cyclical, you can set the number at a slightly higher level, and which will be much more possibly believable for the market, much more credible, and you give a realistic estimate of all your revenue items, as well as you need to be focusing a lot more on the quality of your expenditure items, rather than focusing all the time only on a broad headline deficit number. So possibly a slightly higher fiscal deficit number with very credible maths and good composition of expenditure may not be a bad outcome compared to a very rosy assumption to start with.
Okay, Mr. Bagga, very quickly, one thing that you would watch out for, one key hope tomorrow.
What is the stimulus coming into the economy? I think the growth stimulus is the most important thing. Fiscal, where exactly it's directed, all those things will dovetail into that, Niraj. biggest thing is it a pro-growth budget, or will it be just announcing another 100 schemes without any clarity on the funding? So more very clarity of the accounting, clarity of your actual numbers, and a pro-growth number, and a statement coming and saying that don't worry, we are with you, we are going to ensure growth comes back, which boosts the sentiment. I think sentimental boost and growth stimulus, these are the two big lessons we would like to draw from tomorrow's budget.
Gentlemen, all of you, thank you so much for taking the time out and speaking to us post the economic survey. Really appreciate your time. And viewers, thanks for tuning in to this broadcast on the economic survey.
City Union